Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast, hosted by Dave Jenkins. The Equipping You in Grace podcast is a podcast about helping Christians develop a biblical worldview in a conversational tone about issues inside and outside the church. Now, for today's episode, let's join our host, Dave Jenkins.
All right, guys. Well, welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for this podcast. And with me today, I have my friend, Deborah Howard. Deborah, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dave. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, great. Great to have you back. Can you just catch us up? What's been happening since we last talked in your life, in your marriage, ministry? What projects are you working on? You know, those kind of things.
Well, things are about the same as they were the last time. My husband and I did celebrate our 35th wedding anniversary. That was a big thing. And since I've talked to you, I've had another birthday. My son has had another birthday, my grandson. So time does move on, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, congratulations on your wedding anniversary. That's exciting.
Thanks. And right now I'm working on a new book. I've got a book called, it's going to be called A Quiet Confidence. The subtitle is From Christian Worrier to Christian Warrior. And it takes about 12 of the most comforting passages of Scripture and exposits those so that people are reminded of the promises of God and why they don't need to be worriers. Because of prayer, because of our access to God, we can be warriors. And so I'm on chapter 4 of 12. So I've got my work cut out for me. But that's what I'm working on right now.
That sounds great. Well, you know, today we're going to talk about your mini book that you wrote a few years back, Help, I'm So Lonely. It's in that wonderful series, the Lifeline series that we're both going to be part of here soon. Tell us why you wrote this book, you know, and maybe if you've heard how it's been received, people have been helped by it and those things.
Well, Help, I'm So Lonely is the name of the book. And it came about because of a request by a friend. I'd gone to visit him in the hospital. He had lost his wife to cancer about 2 years previous to that. And he was having trouble getting back into life. He was still just wrapped in grief and loneliness. And he, with tears in his eyes, he said, I want your next project to be to write a book about loneliness from a Christian perspective. He said, I've been looking for books out there on this subject and I'm not seeing them. And I said, okay, that will be my next book. He and his wife, they were two of our very best friends. And so they were sort of one of these couples joined at the hip. And when she died, it was like, he said it was like an amputation. And he lived with this pain. So I promised him I would write a book on loneliness. And unfortunately, he died before the book was published, so he never got to read it. But I did dedicate the book to him. And so that's how it happened. It was as a favor to him.
I know we've talked about people that mean a lot to us, and you know it's good to remember the good things. You know, it's a healthy thing to remember people that made an impact on us and just be thankful for them. And so I thought this was a great little mini book. You know, wonderfully written and very helpful. So
you forced me with this interview to read it yesterday.
Yeah.
And once again, I was so gratified because I think it's intensely helpful. And I think a lot of times it's easy for people to kind of send the message of, okay, it's time for you to get over it, you know, that kind of message. And they're not very compassionate or empathetic. And everybody has their own preset standards for how long grieving should last and what it should look like. And I know that there are many, many different kinds of loneliness, and not all of them have to do with losing a loved one. But in this case, since it was Bill asking me to write this, I think it does a good job of recognizing that kind of pain that people go through. I'm trying to recognize their pain and then move them along and show them by giving them some practical suggestions how to maybe re-engage in life again. And but even though this is about loneliness, all the suggestions that I made can be also applied to depression or grief. So it's not just loneliness. I think that it really covers more than just that.
Yeah, as you're talking there, I really appreciate what you're saying about, almost like feel what you feel. Don't stuff it down, because they've done a lot of secular, in the secular world, they've done a lot of studies on the impact of stuffing down, and it can cause they say it can even cause mental illness, and, significant mental illness, your blood pressure to rise. And the body isn't meant, God didn't create us to stuff our emotions down. Everybody deals with their emotions in a different way, but everybody has to figure out how to process their emotions. For me, when I was little, my mom put me on Ritalin, and they labeled me ADD, ADHD in my childhood, and then in my teens they thought I was suicidal. I didn't think I was suicidal, but apparently my mom thought I was suicidal, and they put me on Depakote, Wellbutrin, and Zoloft, which they actually put people on cancer patients. And then, funny enough, people think this is weird when I say this, but there was basically God used an atheist Wiccan to get me off of medicine. That's the only way I can explain it. God, in His common grace, God used an atheist Wiccan, and I got off the medicine, and then I could start to feel like emotions. Like before, I felt numb all the time. Emotionally. And that crippled me emotionally. Now I don't think that medication is bad. I think that there are times when medication can be used and be helpful. Like I used to be totally anti-medicine. I'm not that anymore. But at the same time, it's just one of those things where, you have to be able to not be numb to life. Like life has a way of beating us down. Now your story is probably not going to be like mine, and God might not use an atheist Wiccan to get you off medicine. But out of that, people started realizing about 6 months later, I had people asking me when I was in high school. My varsity golf coach asked me, he's like, there's something different. I'm like, I have Jesus. He's like, no, it's not that. He's like, no, people just recognize there's something different about your disposition, and they've commented to me in a good way. I'm like, thank you, but over the years I was like 16 when I got off the medicine. So would have been 98. So it's been about 23 years, but it's been a learning process, because for the first 16 years, I was emotionally basically numb, because of the medicine. And, my mom and I have talked about it, and, I don't have any we don't have any bad feelings about it.
I'm sure she thought she was doing what was best for you at the time.
She did.
I've had quite a bit of experience with counseling people who are depressed. And I agree with you. When you squelch your emotions and you're not dealing with them, you're just not, it colors every aspect of your life. You think that you're keeping it to yourself, but really it's affecting just about every area, and because it's affecting you. And so I think a lot of times when people are hurting, they're looking for solutions at any cost. So they're looking at antidepressant medications and stuff like that. And as a nurse, I know that many times antidepressant medication is really good for people who have a chemical imbalance in their brains, who truly have a chemical imbalance in their brains. But if it's a situational depression, if it's a situational feeling of loneliness, there is not a pill in the world who is going to restore to you the joy that is available only through the true source of joy. And so if it's a situational depression, then the solution is not through medication, but through some of the healthier ways that I've identified in this book of moving through that.
Yeah. Let's dive into that. What are some of the warning signs that someone might need additional help, processing grief and loss?
Well, like I said, grief takes different forms for different people. So you have to, not everybody is going to, for instance, when somebody dies, I had one person that I knew who died. The next day, she was moving her husband's stuff out of the house. The next day, she was packing up his books, packing up his clothes, and getting them all out of the house because she knew that that would have to happen eventually. And she's a very practical person. And she just said, I may as well do it now. It's not going to hurt any less later. So for me, I could not have done that. I could not have just immediately gotten everything out of the house. Other people, they hang on to every piece of clothing. They hang on to every picture, every card, everything. So you cannot judge people's grieving. It's an individual kind of thing. But there are things that you can look at as warning signs that they are not experiencing grief in a healthy way. And one of those is if they have persistent thoughts of suicide or of self-destructive thoughts. Those are not part of a normal grieving process. I know when your heart is broken, sometimes you feel like you could die. You feel like you would want to die. But that's different than what I'm talking about, where you have persistent, repetitive thoughts about taking your own life or doing cutting or whatever self-harm. That is not normal. And you need to seek help if those things are taking place. Another one is a failure to provide for your basic needs. They stop showering. They stop brushing their teeth. They stop eating. They either sleep all the time or they can't sleep at all. And so that's one of the things that we as their friends and loved ones need to watch out for is any change in their weight. Because if they're eating their grief, that's not helpful. Or if they're starving their grief, that's not helpful. That's not something that is a healthy way. And so sometimes you do have to intervene. And so when you see somebody who has always taken care of their grooming, the way they're dressed, the way they look, the way they move, and suddenly you see a massive change in that, then that could be a time that you need to step in. Persistent depression that affects your ability to function in life. If your depression or your loneliness is so acute that it is causing substantial disruption in the way you're able to carry out your work, for instance, or the way you're able to relate to other people, or even the way you fit into your family structure, that's not normal. And so that may be a warning sign that we need to step in. And then you go from that to substance abuse. Some people, like I said, they want relief at any cost. So sometimes they turn to substance abuse. And I'm talking about alcohol, drugs, tranquilizers, sedatives, sleeping pills, and even food. If you're turning to food food can be used as a drug, And so if you're turning to any of those things for help, that's not healthy for you. That's not normal. And those could be some warning signs. And the last thing I would say, some people experience this so much, they start experiencing mental illnesses. Like they hear things that other people can't hear. They see things that others don't see. And they start having delusions and confusion. And if you see that happening in somebody's life, please step in and try to help, because those kinds of things are not healthy grieving. That shows that you have moved from healthy grieving into dysfunction. And dysfunction seems to be the primary warning sign.
Yeah, one thing that I think is really, really helpful, and I don't think it's utilized enough or even talked about enough, it's just the place of the local church and even friends in the local church. Because I know, like, for me, just, having somebody to talk with or whatever, often that'll be and just sharing with them, hey, this is what's happening or whatever. That's just been so big for me. Some people think, oh, I have to give that person advice. It's like, for me, I don't really need the advice. I just want somebody to sit there and listen. Mm-hmm. Maybe sometimes they're going to offer advice in the course of conversation, and I'm okay with that. Like, I'm not saying that, but I just think that's such a underutilized, under talked about aspect in care in the church. Maybe I'll write a book on it at some point. But it's just so. I know we talked about it like last time too, and I just think when we talk about loneliness, I mean, you can't. Every single one of us needs friends that maybe we don't need the word of encouragement. We just need the listening ear. And
we need to be heard. And you're right. We'll cover this when we get to the practical suggestions. But yeah, a lot of times we need to be heard. We don't need to be lectured, and we don't need to be preached to. When our hearts are breaking, that's not particularly the most effective or considerate thing you can do. When our hearts are breaking, if there's somebody who can listen to you without being eager to share their own story, just listen to what you have to say. It's hard enough to talk, but when somebody is completely taking your story away and bringing their story into it, it can be very frustrating to try to talk to people if they don't know how to listen. People think they need to do something. They need to help you in some way. They don't realize that just merely by listening, you're helping.
Yeah, that's true. Well, tell us a little bit about this questionnaire you developed on loneliness. I thought that was particularly very helpful.
When Bill asked me to write this book, at first I didn't know if I'd be able to, because I don't recall a time in my life when I've been lonely. I went directly from my parents' house to college, to a dorm where I was with people, then to being married, to having children, to now those children are gone, but I'm still married. And so I've never actually lived by myself. So I started thinking that maybe I wasn't the one to write this book. But I do know a lot of people who have been bereaved or who have had periods of loneliness in their life. I started thinking, why don't I devise a questionnaire and send it out to people and see how they dealt with it, whether it was successfully or not successfully. And these people were at varying stages in their grief or loneliness process. So I sent this questionnaire out, and I think I sent out like 40 or 50 of them. And then when I got them back and I started seeing people's responses to the questions, I was amazed at how many differences there were between these people. But I was also amazed with how many similarities there were. So I started looking at these answers to these questions that I put out. And I did, in chapter 1 of this book, I did list the questions that I had asked them. And then I tried to give the reader a range of responses so that I think they'll be able to identify with some of the ways these people answered. So the questionnaire was huge in establishing the foundation for writing this book.
That's really good. Really good. I really like it. How does the Bible address loneliness?
At first, I hardly anything came to mind. So I started researching the scriptures and studying, and it's astounding how many passages there are in the scriptures that deal with loneliness or pain, angst, anxiety, depression. Especially in the Psalms, you see it many, many times. It's King David, and he wrote these Psalms, and it just expresses his utter depth of his depression or loneliness or fear or whatever. And then, but one thing about that is that the scriptures hardly ever leave it there. If you read the rest of the Psalm, you see that it always ends in praise for God, because they remember his kindness. They remember who he is. And I've included in the book many of these passages that deal with this. And I think the reader will, again, be able to identify with some of these intense emotions that are expressed in the scriptures.
Yeah, that's really good. As you're talking, I was just remembering an article I wrote on immutability, the unchanging nature of God, essentially. And I mean, if you think about it, the immutable character of God, just if you understand what that is, what that'll do is it'll help you to face your loneliness. Because like passages like Hebrews 13:5 and 9 tell us Jesus is the same yesterday and today and forevermore. There's the immutable character of God. He is unchanging. We're changing because he's unchanging, and that actually helps us in the midst of loneliness to see here's a steady anchor for our souls. Yeah, go ahead.
I heard a sermon by D.A. Carson one time about going through adversity with a godly attitude. And he says, he was talking about the James 1 passage about God does not change. He does not change like shifting shadows. And he said, God does not wake up on the wrong side of the bed. He does not wake up and have it out for you one day and not the next. That God's unchangeability is really, like you said, it's one of the mainstays of the Christian faith, because, this is not a fickle God. He is the same faithful, strong, loving God that he always is. And people like to say that he does change, but or that he's got it in for them or something like that. That is never the case. For a believer, he never has it against you. He never has a bad day. He never wakes up grumpy like we do. So we can't attribute to God the things that happen with us.
Yeah. Well, how does the sufficiency of Christ help address our need to grow in contentment?
Well, we covered this in the last interview we talked about, but I think that the presence of God the presence of Christ with you is the solution to every problem. And there's an exercise I do sometimes with people that I'm counseling where I have they're telling me about these horrible situations, and then they are very emotionally distraught at those times when they're telling me. And sometimes I'll have them just close their eyes and imagine opening a door to this most glorious, radiant room where the light is just pouring forth. And in the middle of this room stands Jesus Christ. And they walk towards him. And when they get close, they look up into his face, and he reaches out his hands to them. They take his hands, and then he wraps them in a strong embrace. Well, when you're picturing through every step of this, and then picturing you in the embrace of Christ with him enveloped around you, how important is your situation in light of that? And I think that even though that's imagination, that we can do that because we can still spend time with him. And we do it through prayer. We do it through study. We do it through knowing who he is by what he says in his word. And so that self-sufficiency of Christ is the source of all comfort. And a lot of times we view our situations as the most dire thing that's happening. And we can't believe other people are still walking around talking and laughing when your whole life has come crashing down. And I think that's a normal thing. But when you think about who Christ is, and you think about the overarching view of the scriptures, and you look at your own situation through the lens of scripture, through the lens of God's sovereignty, and you realize that this is, no matter how painful, it's a stop along the way in how he's molding you and bringing you along in your life. And the very things that you would never script if you were writing that, like losing a loved one or losing your job or having to file bankruptcy or any of those kinds of things that are very tough. They're designed for you for a purpose. They're not frivolous. And they're designed to make you stronger, better, and to help you move along in your spiritual walk. Many times they're designed to help you be able to comfort somebody else who's going through a similar problem that you are. And if you had not had that experience, you would not be in a position to help them. So I think the sufficiency of Christ is everything. Yeah. And that's why I encourage people to stay in the scriptures. You may not feel like studying that day. God may seem far off to you, but And there's this, you've seen it, I'm sure, on marquees and stuff. If God seems far away, guess who moved? It wasn't God, right? So he's always there for his people. We have access to him, which is such a privilege. And he can be there in a real way when you are going through pain and suffering and loneliness.
So good. So good. I've been, working on that, which I think we've talked about it. I've told people I'm working on this book on contentment. But what's interesting is I've been reading Philippians 4 again and again and again. Things, when you read the scriptures over and over again, things start to pop, at least for me. I don't know, especially like in context. That's where my training is in hermeneutics, like academically. And so as I do that, things really pop. And one thing that's really stood out in verse 5 of Philippians 4 is it says, the Lord is at hand. Everything else that he says that follows, the theological reason that, you can be anxious for nothing, it's right there. The Lord is at hand. The Lord is near. He's present. We know he's everywhere at all times in all places. He knows our thoughts. He knows the hairs on our head. He knows the length of our days. But everything that follows, he says, is because of that truth. The Lord is at hand. That's a theological underpinning for everything. Why we're not anxious for anything. Why we have, the peace of God. Why we can pray. Why we can give thanksgiving. Why we can make our requests known to God. Why we can guard our hearts and minds in Christ, why we can think in a way that honors him, why we can be content, because like you said, of the sufficiency of Christ. But everything is wrapped up in that idea to Paul. It's just like the more I'm thinking about it, I'm just like, wow, it's really mind blowing.
It's a beautiful concept. Yeah. He says,
three words, and yet boom, like you would read that and be like, no, that's not it, That's the whole idea. The whole crux of the everything that he's talking about it goes back to that.
Yeah, because he tells us, do not be discouraged. I am with you. I recently read Joshua. He says that over and over and over again to try to encourage his people. Do not be discouraged. Don't be afraid. I'm with you always. And he makes the same promises in the New Testament as well. That is one beautiful aspect of our relationship with God, is the direct access we have to him.
So good. What are some strategies that can help someone to process their loneliness?
Well, there are several that I covered in the book. One of them is to spend time with people. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, when people are lonely, sometimes the thing they want to do least is spend time with people, because being with people are draining to them. And sometimes they feel worse after being with people than they did before. But I'm still going to say they need to spend time with people. If you are isolating yourself, what you're doing is you're turning inwards. You're turning inside. And when you turn inwards, there's an abyss there. When do you ever stop falling? It's only when you're giving out that, like when you are with people, what that forces you to do is think outside yourself for just a little while and to think about somebody else. One thing that I've suggested in here is to go out to lunch with a friend, and they may say, and I've had counselees say this, I just don't feel like being with anybody. I'm terrible company. I don't think I can do it, and I will say, do it anyway. And then what they do, they come back and they say, well, I did that, but I felt worse afterwards than I did before. I was distracted. I couldn't listen. I don't think I'm going to do it anymore. I said, no, you need to go do it again. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 times of doing this, of being disciplined to spend time even one-on-one with people. And then you realize finally, hey, guess what? I'm actually enjoying talking to these people. Or guess what? I actually care what's going on in their lives, instead of focusing so much on my own. And little by little, if you continue, little by little, it helps you get out of this funk of loneliness and depression and isolation that you feel. So I would say, even if you don't feel like being with people, be with people. That's a very important strategy. Another is, I'll just mention this one because it's so obvious in my brain right now because, I've got this window here. I keep looking out there, but the trees are absolutely glorious right now. So many colors, and the leaves are so intensely red and yellow and brown and rust, and it sometimes just takes your breath away. So another strategy that I've listed is to spend time in nature, to just use your senses, to forget about your problems just for a little bit and to use your senses. What are you smelling? Do you smell a salt breeze? Do you smell pine in a pine forest? Or listen, use your ears and listen to the sounds of nature. And then just look all around you, because guess what? God is the greatest painter who ever existed. Mm. And being in nature has a tendency to nurture and nourish people. If you're locked up in your house all the time, you can forget that it's day or night. You can forget that there are moon and stars. You can forget that there's beautiful sunshine and white fluffy clouds. So don't lock yourself in your house, figuratively or literally. Go outside and experience what God has given us in this creation. Let it nurture you. So that's another one of the strategies that I've talked about.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking about. I remember there was when I was involved with campus ministry. This is just out of high school, so 2000, 2001, and there was this pastor I would meet with, and we would talk, and we would just talk about theology and life, and he'd ask me how I was, and so towards the end, I would start sharing about toward maybe like 40 minutes in, we had talked about theology, and then I felt comfortable to talk about what's going on. He would say, and I remember this, he would say, I wish you'd started sharing about what was happening with you at the beginning of our time together. And I thought about that, and it hit me. You know what he's really asking? He's really asking me, would I just please open up and start at the beginning, just be comfortable with him. And there is a sense in which you can overshare with people. So I'm not saying like you go and to somebody you just met and go, hello, I'm a beautiful flower, I've got the next number of things, and you list like everything, and the person's like, holy smokes, you just like, I had no idea. I don't know you, like there's an appropriate level like of sharing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it just hit me like one day. I don't even remember when it hit me, but sometimes, things that happen, and you think about it, or it comes back to your memory, or something jogs your memory. And it was one of those moments for me where I just recognized, I need to really work on that. And that was really actually one of the most helpful things for me that somebody could really say, because, he was meeting to hear, not just talk about theology, but to talk about our lives. And, so somebody's like interested in you and investing in you, that the same kind of thing applies to loneliness. Don't just, like you said, don't just lock yourself in your house. Don't just, shut down emotionally. I'm reminded of, I just had a really good friend die. And sometimes even with my parents, I have a really, really bad day. And I'm like, I don't know if I feel so emotionally numb, like on a Sunday, for example. I'm like, I don't even want to, I'm not going to get when I get into this kind of frame of mind, like going and sitting at church and even worship music, and the sermon, as bad as it sounds, I don't get anything out of it. It's like, I might as well not even be there, to be honest. My wife's like, I know that when you're in that mood, I just want to encourage you to go, with me. And I do go with her. I didn't think I would be able to go the day that I knew he died, to small group, but I was so glad I did, because, and I even said to her, I said, Mike would have wanted me to be here tonight. He actually died when we were there and at the small group. And that was good to be around people in those moments. And, so don't, I guess the point that I'm making is, if somebody asks you how you are, don't just, brush that aside and just think, oh, they're trying to be intrusive. Maybe they are, but you know what? Don't take it that way. Like I did many years ago now. Just share maybe a little bit of what's happening with you, because they're probably asking because they're genuinely concerned for you and wanting to know what's happening and how they can help and how they can pray for you. Some of these things they've helped me, and that's what I would probably say to help loneliness. And the other big thing is that can help loneliness is to make a practice. Life is short. Make a practice of saying meaningful things to people that mean a lot to you, and just do it over and over again for the rest of your life. I think when my grandpa died, I got that out of it, and it was reinforced when I got married and learned my wife's story, which is pretty tragic, God's story in her life, and it just was reminded me, okay, say the most meaningful things now, because you don't know when that person's going to die. And so just reminded of that even a month ago, a day before my dear friend died, I texted him meaningful things, and I would do that as a practice. But I got to do that, and it helps to deal with the grief, because you said the things that mean the most to them. And so if they die, you've said what matters most. You've said you've kept saying the things that mean the most. And so you don't just store it up until, like, some people, oh, I'm going to say those things when that person dies. Like, say them now and keep saying them over and over and over again. So, and I'll keep hammering that, guys, on this podcast, because it's so important to do. It's just so important to do.
Yeah. Don't be one of those people who say, I wish he knew how much I cared for him, or I wish he knew how much he meant to me in my life, or I wish he knew how instrumental he was in my life. Those are not things you want to save up for when a person dies. Try to live without regrets. And I decided a long time ago, and people know that I'm a very gushy person, and they know that I'm very affectionate, and I tell people all the time, I love you. I think you're beautiful. I think this and that. I don't keep those things in because I don't want to be one of those people that said, I wish they knew how much I really cared for them. So people know I'm kind of sappy, but they love me anyways. So
wonderful. I love it. Love it. Well, how can the local church help those facing loneliness?
Well, I do think the local church has a responsibility to help their flock when they're sick or when they're down. But there's also a responsibility that each member of that flock has to let their elders or the leadership in their church know what they're going through. A lot of times, like you said, people will ask you, you'll go to church and your pastor will say, hey, how are you doing? And you say, fine, fine, fine. This fine, it seems to, they think that you actually mean what you're saying, and you should mean what you're saying. So I think when you're saying fine, that's really you putting a mask on. And if your elders don't, or the leadership of your church, if they don't know what you're going through, they sort of can't be held responsible for not ministering to you. So I think the first thing you can do is let somebody know what you're going through. Let somebody know that that you have needs right now, spiritual needs. And you know what? I know a lot of clergy. I know a lot of elders and people in leadership roles in the church. They long to be there for their flock. They long to help. They want you to let them know what's going on with you. And especially in a large church like ours, I guess care groups or community groups or whatever you call them, those are the groups that find out what's going on maybe first. But you need to let the leadership know, because they can't help if they don't know there's a problem. Now, after they know there's a problem, yes, let them be the hands and arms and heart of God towards you. If you need counsel, let them provide it. If you have physical needs, let them let them provide that for you, because that's what they're there for. They're not called shepherds for nothing, and the sheep depend on the shepherd for everything. We have a great shepherd. We depend on him for all things, but he has also put your shepherds at your church over you. Let them know when there's a problem, and then let them minister to you. Too many times people's pride gets in the way. They don't want their pastors to know they're struggling. They don't want their pastors to know what shape they're actually in. And so they wear this mask that says, oh, fine, I'm doing fine. And you've got to let people in. Like you were saying, it's important to let people in and let people know that you have needs right now, and let them fulfill those needs. So it's a two-way street. Yes, the church has a responsibility, but you also have a responsibility.
Yeah.
Now, in a small church, that may not be an issue because everybody knows everybody's business in a small church. But I go to a large church, and if people did not let people know what was going on, a lot of times that would go undetected.
That's really good. There's two things I think I would add to that. One, recognize that the church is not the place where, like you're saying, it's the place where you can drop the mask, drop the facade, and be who you are, And second, I would say to pastors, or even whether you're a deacon or an elder or a pastor, or you're just serving in the church, especially the pastor preaching or pastors preaching, depending on how many you have. From the pulpit, tell the people, hey, if you have something going on, I would love to hear about it. We're here to walk alongside of you. And that just reinforces a culture of care. And people are more likely over time to be like, hey, these aren't just words, they're going to see it in action. Like if you have if you're in the hospital, we want to know about that. If your marriage is struggling, we want to know about that. Husbands, encourage your wife, to be involved with other ladies and to share about, don't just, ladies talk, right? Encourage your wife to share, issues, and don't be afraid of the consequences. If you guys are having issues in your marriage, don't be afraid, guys, of your wife sharing about those, and don't be afraid to share those with other guys. Like you said, pride. We got to drop the pride. We got to drop the facade. Like if the church is a place where we should be able to come as Christians and to receive. I mean, we're just supposed to receive love and care there. The small group is a great place for that to happen. And that's where most pastors would first want that to happen. And then the pastors would become involved at some point after the group has cared for that individual. Now, I'm not saying that the pastor isn't primarily responsible for them, but in most churches, even small churches, they have small groups for that purpose. And so, if you're leading a small group, if you see somebody that's sharing repeatedly over and over again, realize that you're part of your job there. What they're telling you, you have to pay attention to what people are saying. They're going to give you opportunities to minister to them. Pay attention if somebody is week in, week out, or even every other month or whatever, because sometimes people won't share because they're like, if I say that over and over again, then somebody's going to think badly of me. But if somebody is saying something, to say, hey, can we get together and talk? You're not in trouble or anything like that. Just, hey, I noticed that you're sharing about this. I want to hear more about that. I want to come alongside you. I want to put an arm around your shoulder. The same thing with like just sit there. One of the most effective things that I learned from Mike, my dear friend, he would just sit there and he would listen. He would very rarely say much. Although if he did, I'd say, you know what, brother, the choir needs preaching to, so you go right ahead. You just go ahead and preach. And we would laugh every time he said that, because he knew that I knew whatever he was going to tell me, I probably knew, which is okay. But I still need the preaching too, but that's such a big thing. And then he would put his hand on my hand and pray for me. And that's such a powerful thing. Like that communicates love. It communicates care. Then he would come and, obviously us being guys, he would give me a hug. And, those are the kind of things that build trust and communicate love and care. And it's beautiful. It's wonderful. it honors Christ that when we do these things. And so those are some things I would say to small group leaders, to pastors, to even biblical counselors. Obviously, if you're a guy, and I'm not saying you go and counsel a woman and then you put your arm around her and give her a hug, or put your hand on another woman other than your wife's hand or anything like that. But, just be appropriate, use some common sense in that. But at the same time, be intentional in that. There's a way to do it. Even with guy and women interactions, you can ask your sister in Christ, how are you doing? You can be a friend in an appropriate way with your sister in Christ. And we need that. We need one another way more than we even think. I've over the last, decade or so, I've become more and more recognize this. And that's why I, we've moved 3 times in the last 4 years. And every time I've pursued accountability, because I need it. I need friends that are going to be there for me. And I know that through the stuff that my parents are going through. And I know that I need it, because there's going to be days when I'm like a wreck, just an absolute wreck. And those are the days when I really need to lean hard on those who care about me. And the church is there for that. And our friends are there for that. And so be that friend who listens, who cares, who loves, and is really intentional in that. I think every Christian wants to be used by God. I really believe that. And that's how you can be used by God. And you may not have a huge blog or a podcast or whatever, and who cares? You're like, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me. And people think that I have that. So it doesn't matter, just be that friend and you can be used by God. So yeah, we could go on and on with that. So you get me started on that, and we won't end. We won't stop. We'll just keep going for a while and be like, oops, I went a little too far.
I think it's your goal to make me weepy today. So
I'm sorry.
Well, when you were talking about listening, I just want to say that sometimes you have to read between the lines. Sometimes people have a tough time expressing themselves. They may not feel comfortable doing it, but God gave you a brain that can use discretion, and you can discern what's going on behind the comments, and then you clarify by actually asking them. And sometimes it requires reading between the lines to get to the pain that they are trying to hide, but most of the time they're not hiding it very well. Not if you're using discernment and really trying to listen to them. Yeah, that's an important issue.
Oh, that's so good. So good. Where can people go to find out more about you online, on social media, or otherwise, friend? God bless you. You're a blessing.
Well, I do have a website. It's www.deborahhoward.net, and you can keep up with what I'm doing on there. And also, you can friend me on Facebook because I do post announcements and interviews and new books and things that are going on in my life as a writer. And you might also get to see some awfully cute pictures of my grandson. So, so you can friend me on Facebook. Also on your website, I believe I've got some articles and things like that.
Yeah. Yep. Good to have you writing. Good to have you writing for us.
Well, yeah. The other thing would be to pick up any of my books, because I'll tell you what, this may look like a book to you, but this is really my heart. If you want to see my heart, this is what it looks like. So just pick up any of my books, and I think you'll learn more about Deborah Howard than you ever wanted to know.
That's wonderful. That's true. That's true. There's a lot, and I always say this at the end, there's a lot that we could talk about. We never cover everything. So we really do skim the surface in these interviews, but, hopefully what we've said has been helpful. And just as we wrap up, do you have any takeaways for us?
I do have a couple of things I want to say. Number one, I know you see me dabbing my eyes. Don't be afraid of tears. Don't be afraid to cry. A lot of people think that indicates a weakness, a spiritual weakness, if they're crying. And they try to hide that. They try to suppress the tears. But it's not a weakness to cry, because, I mean, even Jesus shed tears. And it's not wrong. There's no shame in that. So I encourage people, if the tears well up, cry. Crying is therapeutic. Many times I'll tell them, cry ugly. When this feeling hits, do big, blubbering, sobbing, ugly crying, and get it out of your system. And then don't stay there, but get up and go about your life until the next time this happens. And I think you'll see that if you give yourself over, like you were saying, give yourself permission to feel what you're feeling, I think you'll find that those episodes happen less and less often. But if you never give vent to that, it may happen quite a bit. So I'm just saying, don't be afraid or embarrassed to cry. It would be ridiculous, say, to live with somebody for 50 years and love that person with all your heart. They die and you never shed a tear. A lot of times, I've said this before, but people give you more grace when you lose a pet than they do when you lose a spouse. And their expectations sometimes influence how you allow yourself to feel. Don't do that. Don't let anybody else control that. So give yourself permission to feel what you're feeling, and do it with your whole heart. And then don't stay there, but pick yourself up and go about your life. And the second thing is that I've found this not only as my experience with people in counseling, or my experience with friends and family, but also as a result of that questionnaire I sent out. A lot of people start feeling guilty when they start recovering. They feel guilty if they actually enjoy something, and they let their guilt blackmail them into staying in that dark place. They feel like they're betraying their spouse if they start to move along in life. Please do not feel like that. Please try to work through that, because if your spouse, or the person that you are missing the most, if they could talk to you, they would not say, live your life as a martyr for me. They would say, please move on with your life. I want you to be happy. I want your life to mean something. So, they would be the last person that would want you to hole up in your house and build walls around your heart and feel guilt when you start feeling joy again. They want you to live a joyful life. So I would just caution you about those two things. Don't be afraid to cry, and try not to feel guilt when you start being able to move on in your life. It does not indicate that you don't love them anymore. You will always love them. They will always be a part of your life. They will always have that impact that they left on you. But you don't have to demonstrate that by staying in a mourning or a lonely situation for the rest of your life. Go ahead, take a step, move forward. One thing I would say about this book is that when I give you the helpful suggestions in the last chapter, it's not so much about doing that activity, but doing that activity will lead you to the concept that life does go on. And we forget this when we're in intense loneliness or depression. We forget that life is moving on. It does for other people, but we don't perceive it happening to us. So I'm just saying, these activities that I've suggested you do, the main point is so that you would remember life does go on, and help you to find joy in the life that God has given you.
That is wonderful. I mean, really, that's really, really good. I think that wraps up our episode. Thank you so much for your time, guys. We've been talking today with my friend Deborah Howard about her mini book, Help, I'm So Lonely. It's part of the Lifeline miniseries that is so excellent. I cannot recommend it enough for you. I encourage you to pick up this one and another one. They're very cheap, so They don't cost you much, but they will really help you. But thank you so much, Deborah, for your time and for your friendship and ministry.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Thank you for listening to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, rate us on the app, and share this with your friends and family on social media. If you want to find us on social media, you can find us on Twitter @Servants of Grace, on Instagram @Servants of Grace, or by searching @Servants of Grace on Facebook. You can also find this episode and many others like it on the front page of our website, servantsofgrace.org.